The note was found in his jacket pocket. He had written it in the dark, by feel, with his hands shaking from the cold and the carbon dioxide already poisoning his blood. He could not see what he was writing. He could not feel his fingers, but he wanted his wife to know he had thought of her at the end. His name was Dmitry Kolesnikov. He was a captain in the Russian Navy. He was 27 years old, and he was sitting in total darkness at the bottom of the Barents Sea, in a steel tomb that had once been the most advanced submarine ever built. Around him, 22 other men, cold, bleeding, slowly suffocating, but alive. For at least 6 hours they would stay alive. Above them, on the surface, the Russian Navy already knew their submarine had been destroyed. The British and Norwegian governments were offering help. They had ships, specialized divers, rescue submarines designed for exactly this kind of disaster. The Russian government said no. For 5 days they said no. By the time the answer changed, every single man in that compartment was dead. And the world would soon learn that the Russian government had been lying about almost every detail. The submarine had not grounded. The crew had not died instantly. The hatch had not been jammed. 23 men had been alive at the bottom of the sea, and the country that built them, trained them, and sent them to war had let them die. This is the story of the Kursk and what happened in the silent, freezing darkness of Compartment Number 9. Today, you'll understand 3 things. First, the chemistry of a single torpedo fuel was so dangerous that most of the world's navies had banned it years before this disaster. A liquid that expands 5,000 times its own volume in the wrong conditions. The Russian Navy was still using it. They knew the risks. They used it anyway. Second, the 134 seconds between the first explosion and the second. The 2 minutes when men in the back of the submarine knew something was wrong, knew the front of their ship was on fire, and ran for the only place that might still keep them alive. And third, the rescue that didn't happen. The hatch that wasn't really stuck, the buoy that had been welded shut, and the foreign divers who, in a single afternoon, did what the entire Russian Navy had failed to do in 5 days, by ignoring the Russian instructions entirely. This isn't just the story of a submarine accident, it's the story of a state that chose silence over the lives of its own sailors. The K-141 Kursk was, on paper, one of the most powerful warships ever built. She was a Project 949A submarine, known in NATO codes as an Oscar II, launched in 1994, nuclear-powered, twin reactors, 155 meters long, almost the length of 2 airliners parked nose to tail. She had been engineered for one specific mission, to hunt and destroy American aircraft carriers. Her hull had 2 layers. The outer skin was coated in 80 millimeters of acoustic rubber to make her invisible to sonar. Inside the outer hull was a second pressure hull, 51 millimeters of steel, built to survive depths of 1,000 meters. She carried 24 cruise missiles in her silos, crew of 118. She had a reputation among Russian sailors. They called her unsinkable. In the summer of 2000, the Russian Northern Fleet announced its first large naval exercise in over a decade. It was called Summer X. The Kursk would be its centerpiece, and as a special privilege, she would be allowed to carry actual live combat weapons, not just training rounds. What nobody on board fully understood, what their commanders had quietly decided not to tell them, was that some of those weapons had been built in 1990 from a batch of 10 torpedoes. 6 of those 10 had already been rejected for faulty welds. The remaining 4 had been kept in active service. One of them was now loaded into torpedo tube number 4. The weapon at the center of this tragedy was a Type 65 torpedo, a 650mm long-range anti-carrier weapon. Russian sailors had a nickname for it because of its enormous size. They called it the Tolstushka. In English, that word means fat girl. It was the largest torpedo in active service anywhere in the world. And the reason it was so feared by NATO navies wasn't just its size, it was the fuel inside it. That fuel was called high-test peroxide, a concentrated form of hydrogen peroxide, the same chemical you might keep in a small bottle in your bathroom, but at a strength so pure, so unstable, that it had been banned by the British Royal Navy decades earlier, after a similar accident killed their own sailors. Now, here is something most documentaries never explain. The peroxide wasn't the explosive, it was the breath for the engine. A torpedo cannot use the kind of engine a car uses, because there is no air underwater for the fuel to burn in. So engineers built a different kind of system. The peroxide, when triggered, releases pure oxygen. That oxygen lets the torpedo's fuel burn, deep underwater, without any contact with the surface. The result is a weapon that is incredibly fast, almost silent, and produces almost no exhaust trail in the water. For the Russian Navy, that breath was the key to a torpedo that could outrun an American aircraft carrier. But in the Barents Sea, that breath became a blowtorch, because high-test peroxide has one terrifying property. When it touches certain metals, brass, copper, or even rust, it does not simply burn, it decomposes, violently, almost instantly. A small amount of liquid expands to 5,000 times its own volume in a fraction of a second, releasing massive heat and pressure as it does so. The metal valves inside the Kursk's torpedo tube were made of exactly those materials. That morning, the practice Tolstushka in tube number 4 had a microscopic crack along one of its old welds. As the crew prepared the weapon for firing, a small amount of peroxide began to leak. It reached the brass fittings of the launch tube, and the chemistry began. At 29 seconds past 11:29 in the morning, on August 12, 2000, the first explosion tore through the Kursk's forward compartment. It was not the largest blast ever recorded, about 100 to 250 kilograms of TNT equivalent, but inside a sealed steel tube, it was enough. It blew the inner and outer doors of the torpedo tube clean off. The inner hatch was later found embedded 12 meters deep inside a steel bulkhead. The forward compartment filled with fire, 2,700 degrees, white hot. In the rear of the submarine, 95 men felt the entire vessel shudder. Some of them, sailors in the 3rd, 4th and 5th compartments, knew immediately what a fire in the torpedo room could lead to. They had 134 seconds, 2 minutes and 14 seconds. In those seconds, men in the center compartments began moving toward the rear of the ship, toward the 9th compartment, where the only emergency escape hatch was located. At exactly 48 seconds past 11:31, the fire in the forward compartment reached the warheads of 5 to 7 other torpedoes. They detonated together. The second explosion measured 4.2 on the Richter scale, equivalent to 2 to 3 tons of TNT. Seismographs as far away as Norway and Alaska recorded it. It collapsed the forward bulkheads. It killed everyone in the command room instantly, because, against safety protocol, the ventilation ducts above the bulkheads had been left open during the exercise. The blast wave traveled through a single 47-centimeter air vent, bypassing every armored wall the engineers had built. In 134 seconds, 95 men were dead. The Kursk dropped 108 meters to the seabed, and in the back of the ship, in compartment number 9, 23 men were still alive. We know almost everything about what happened next, because 2 of those men wrote it down. The first note, written at 13:15, 1 hour and 45 minutes after the second explosion, was by Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov. His handwriting was clear. The emergency lights still worked. He wrote calmly. He listed exactly which men had reached the compartment from sections 6, 7 and 8. 23 names. He recorded the time. And then he wrote, in his own steady hand, "None of us can get to the surface." The second note from Kolesnikov was written at 15:15, 2 hours after the first. The lights were gone. The compartment was now in total darkness. The air was filling with carbon dioxide. His writing had begun to slant and drift across the page. He could no longer see what he was writing. He wrote simply, "It's dark here to write, but I'll try by feel. It seems we have no chance, between 10 and 20%. Regards to everybody. No need to despair." Another sailor, Lieutenant Commander Rashid Aryapov, was also writing. He had no proper paper, so he tore a page out of a small detective novel he had been carrying. On that page, he wrote the cause of the disaster, as far as he understood it. Faults in the torpedo compartment. 23 men sat in freezing darkness, knowing they were going to die. None of them used the time to curse. None of them wrote anger. They wrote about their families. They left orderly records for the investigators they hoped would one day come. Hours after the second note, the survival systems they were depending on turned on them. The men were using small cartridges of potassium superoxide, chemical packs that absorbed carbon dioxide and released oxygen. It was their only way to breathe. One of these cartridges fell into the oily seawater that had pooled around their feet. The reaction was instant. A flash fire ignited. The compartment filled with toxic smoke and consumed what little oxygen remained. When Norwegian divers finally opened that compartment 8 days later, they would find that the air inside contained only 7% oxygen. By the time the second explosion was even being investigated, hours had already been lost. The flagship of the Russian fleet, the Pyotr Veliki, had felt the hull-shaking shockwave of the blast. Its hydroacoustic sensors had recorded it clearly. Fleet Command was informed. The information was set aside as an exercise event. The Kursk's automatic distress buoy, the device that was supposed to deploy automatically and broadcast the submarine's position to the world the instant the ship was in catastrophic trouble, did not deploy. It could not deploy. The crew had welded it shut a year earlier during a Mediterranean mission. To prevent it from accidentally giving away the submarine's position to NATO, they had never restored it. For 12 hours, the Russian Navy did not officially admit that anything was wrong. When they did finally launch a rescue operation, their domestic equipment failed repeatedly. The rescue submersibles were decades old. Their rubber sealing rings, which were supposed to attach to the Kursk's hatch, had perished from age and neglect. The hatch itself had been warped slightly by the blast, and the 80mm of acoustic stealth rubber on the Kursk's hull, designed to make her invisible, also prevented the rescue subs from forming a watertight seal. Britain and Norway offered help on day 1. Russia refused. Day 2, refused. Day 3, refused. It was only after public outrage, family protests, and a global news cycle that the Russian government finally accepted foreign assistance. By then, 5 days had passed. On August 21st, Norwegian divers reached the rear escape hatch, and here is the detail that should make you angry. The Russian Navy told the Norwegian divers that the air control valve on the hatch had to be turned anti-clockwise to open. The divers tried it exactly as instructed. The valve would not move. So they ignored the Russian instructions and turned the valve the other way, clockwise. It moved easily. The hatch opened in minutes. For 9 days, the Russian Navy had been giving the wrong instructions about how to open a hatch on their own submarine. The men inside might never have been able to use it themselves, even if they had been alive to try. Compartment 9 was flooded. Everyone inside was dead, and the world finally understood what had really happened. The Russian state inquiry took years. It produced 133 volumes of evidence. It confirmed the torpedo, the leaked peroxide, the bypassed ventilation, the false safety instructions, the welded buoy, the rejected weapons batch, and the 12 hours of bureaucratic silence that had cost 23 men their lives. In Russia, almost nobody was held responsible. 13 senior officers were quietly moved to new positions. The country's information laws were tightened. The independent media that had covered the Kursk tragedy too aggressively was, over the following year, brought under state control. President Vladimir Putin, asked months later by an American journalist what had happened to the Kursk, gave the shortest answer of his career. He said, "It sank." The Kursk teaches us something we already saw in another video on this channel, in nuclear war. In every large disaster ever studied, the greatest killer is almost never the initial blast. It is the collapse of the systems that were supposed to follow. Sometimes, the men inside the steel are not killed by the sea, they are killed by the system above them, by an instruction that was never updated, by a buoy that was welded shut, by a phone call that was not made, by a country that chose, for 5 days, the protection of its own pride over the lives of 23 of its own children. The ocean is silent because that is its nature, but the silence on the surface, in the hours after the explosions, in the offices of Russian command, in the days the rescue never came, that silence was a choice. If you want to see the next story, the next silent killer hiding in plain sight, subscribe, because the deepest danger isn't always under the water. Sometimes it's just not being heard.